When we think more about Intune, though, and you start to think about all the data that is on these devices, it's really sensitive data, right? So everything from emails with financial contracts in there to maybe intellectual property, maybe PII, maybe your own customers' data, and not just an email, but maybe in files in your OneDrive, or if you're using Teams and those chat conversations. And so that sensitive data is everywhere. And so you want to be able to protect it no matter where it is. And the interesting thing about Intune is it allows me to not only manage that device if I need to do that, but then, as I mentioned before, manage just that app and encrypt that app. And so now this is interesting. So if I try to take intellectual property, or better yet, maybe some financial data. If I take a credit card number that was in an email that maybe my customer sent me because he wants to, do a purchase order. If I take that credit card number and try to copy it out of an email and paste it into, a web browser or into another application that's not managed by my company, well, there's a firewall there. It actually prevents you from doing that. So it sandboxes it. So it really does allow you to keep your company data safe and secured and compliant to where you have your hands on it at all times. And so what I really like about this, and I go way back in the mobility days. In fact, before Microsoft, I used to work at BlackBerry, and before then I was at Sprint. So mobility is kind of my blood. And when I think about Intune, it's actually pretty cool because as an end user, a lot of times I don't even know that the company is managing the device. So like here at Microsoft, they require us to enroll our device into MDM, but they're really only doing a few things protection-wise on the device. And so as a regular employee or an end user, it doesn't really impact my day-to-day job. I could still, get on my device, access my email, do what I need to do, collaborate, use files, and it really does allow me to balance that productivity, but it also gives IT that security and that compliance that they need. And so that's the really interesting thing here. And so this allows me to really go to any device and be able to do work. So here in my day job, I have 5 devices, believe it or not. I've got a Mac, I've got an iPad, I've got an iPhone, I've got a Surface, I've got another Windows 10 computer, I've got a desktop computer. And if I'm signed in with my Azure Active Directory credentials, right, my Office 365 credentials, so I'm signed in any of those devices with those credentials or into any of those apps, Intune will be applied. So it follows my identity wherever I go. And that's what's interesting. And if I leave the company, they can issue a command, and wherever that identity is signed into, it's going to wipe only that company data. So like my iPad, it's a personal iPad, but I use it in the morning to check email while I'm sipping my coffee or whatever on the couch. And if I leave the company and they submit that request to Intune, Intune will go out and look at my iPad and say, oh, you're signed into Outlook with your corporate credentials. You must have business data in there, so now we're going to remove that access. So you really do get a lot of control around that. I'm going to kind of skip over a couple slides here. I do want to talk about this slide here. And what's interesting is not only are we being able to manage mobile devices, but actual Windows PCs and Macs for that matter. And so if you have a Windows PC in the environment, I can actually manage it to where I could push software to it, including Windows 32 apps. I can manage it completely. I can secure it. I can lock it down. Really, if you're used to group policy and Active Directory, it's basically that. And so this really does allow me to manage even updates to my Windows machines. And so literally I can go down to Best Buy or the Microsoft Store or go on Amazon or wherever, buy a new Windows 10 computer. So let's say I'm out traveling on business and I leave my computer in the back of an Uber. Well, I can go down the street, buy another computer, sign in with my Azure Active Directory username and password with my credentials I use with Office 365. When I sign into that Windows 10 computer with that, Intune will see that as a new business device and automatically push down things like Office, push down my expenses app, push down my other line of business apps. It'll automatically push down the policy to encrypt that device and lock it down if it needs to, and it's ready to go. I don't have to have an image from my IT department. I don't have to have IT, drop ship me a device. I just go down the store and buy one. And that's the power of Intune. And so I think that's really interesting. The other thing I want to mention here before I go into a demo is what we call conditional access. And so let's say I'm using my personal device. I do have a personal Surface. So I'm using my personal Surface and, maybe my kids get on there and they somehow download a virus, right? or that device becomes compromised. Maybe an attacker compromises it through malware or a phishing attack or whatever, right? Well, the next time I go to log into my email or OneDrive or anything, any kind of corporate resource, conditional access kicks in. And so it actually does a scan of the device and it looks at the health of the device. So every time I go to log in, it's talking to things like Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection, and it's talking to the Intune agent running on my device, and it's looking to see if the master boot record's been manipulated, if the firmware has been manipulated, if malware is present, a virus is present. And if any of those things are true, it actually denies me access to the app. So if I try to open up Outlook and get to my email and my device has a virus on it, it won't let me open my email. I think that's pretty powerful, because now we're putting kind of that firewall there to prevent you from compromising the rest of your corporate network. And not only can it be applied to my personal device, but also any other device that maybe my company manages. So if I have desktops in my office, I could apply it there as well. Not only can we do this for Office 365, but you see over here on the far right side, we could also do this for third-party apps. So if my company uses Box as an example, because that's where we have our business processes in, and that's what we're trained to use for file storage and collaboration, that's fine. Through the power of Intune and the Enterprise Mobility and Security suite of products, I can do the same thing. So if I use my Surface and I go to sign into box.com and it notices that there's a virus on my machine, it won't let me access box.com. And so I think there's some really interesting use cases there. And all of that revolves really around Intune. And so my next slide here is, I talked about this a little earlier, the MAM, the mobile application management. This is that sandbox. So you see those dotted lines. It's basically wrapping a security blanket around these managed apps on my personal device. And so if I sign into the Word app here as an example with not only my work email account through Azure Active Directory, but also my Microsoft account, my Live or Outlook.com account, well, it knows that my Azure AD credentials are tied to corporate data, and it knows that my consumer Microsoft account is tied to my personal data. And so it can, if I leave the company, it'll issue a command to only wipe that corporate data. But then I also am able to do the sandbox. So if I try to copy data out, it won't let me copy it. If I try to save that Word document, maybe to the local device, or maybe to another storage provider on that device, it'll block me from doing that. So I could wrap a lot of protection around just that app. And I think this is huge, because especially in the days of 2019 here with BYOD and people wanting to use their own devices at work, let them use their own device. I mean, that's employee morale, that's a retention strategy, that's a recruitment strategy, but then you can still have the control and the compliance you need over the data on those devices. And that's what's so cool about Intune.